afternoon, everyone. My name is David Malpass. I'm Director of Student Affairs at Middlesex University. I'm going to ask Joe and Simon just to introduce themselves, because the three of us are going to present the first bit. So, Simon, do you want to go first?
Hello, everyone. I'm Simon Mary West. I'm Director of Student Experience at the University of Manchester.
Hi, I'm Professor Joe Smith. I'm an Emeritus Professor at the University of Worcester.
All I can see is the Smarten slide, Simon. Right. Okay, so what we're going to do this afternoon is to talk about an institution-wide approach to suicide postvention, and it was really developed by the sector for the sector. So just to really start off on the background, in the 18 months following the start of the first lockdown with the COVID pandemic, at my institution, we experienced 3 suspected student deaths by suicide. Now, part of my role at the university is to lead the university's response when we have such tragic circumstances. And that really led me to question, were my actions appropriate? Was I covering all bases, doing everything we needed to do? Was I acting with sufficient sensitivity, with sufficient compassion? Anything I was missing? What could I do differently? What I could do better? I'm not sure there were many more questions, but you kind of like get the gist in terms of what I was thinking at the time. So I went back and had a look at the Papyrus Universities UK Suicide Safer Universities guidance from 2018, and I very much felt that those 4 pages were framed around what a university, an institution should do, as opposed to how an institution might go about it. And so what I was really looking for was much more practical help and advice from peers at other institutions in a similar position. And so I've reached out to Universities UK. John DePuri put me in touch with Joe, and after a few, Joe Smith that is, after a few Teams meetings, we'd kind of like move the idea from a collaborative workshop to a guidance document. We were then introduced to Simon, and with the 3 of us and John DePuri and Jed from Papyrus, this really formed the core editorial team, and that's really the origins of the guidance, which is a practical resource by the sector for the sector, and the aim is to guide institutions through the postvention process. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about how we went about the task of producing the guidance. So the original document for 2018 was the starting point. So the 5 of us together formed the editorial team, and then what we did was we found a variety of authors who were willing to contribute, provide advice and feedback, and we created a broad stakeholder reference group using people who had experience in postvention. And we also ensured that we involved the devolved nations to take into account, for example, in Scotland, procurator fiscals are there instead of coroners, and through the process we developed a draft framework. So Joe, Simon, and I and Jed and John developed this draft framework, which we then put to the wider group for comment, and then from that we really drafted the guidance over the course of 3 meetings. So we really wanted to make sure that the guidance was informed and shaped by the lived experience and insights So we involve students. So for example, the Student Advisory Committee, a number of bereaved families, staff in the sector, third sector organisations, Samaritans, as well as Papyrus, Student Minds, Charlie Waller Trust. Very much also involves statutory organisations, so Universities UK, Office for Students, DFE, OHID, Moshi, HEFQ, University of Scotland. So we've very much got a wide range of stakeholders together to draft this this document or this guidance remotely over 3 meetings. We then had a small group to review the document, and as you can imagine, a document produced by committee really needed some work. So UUK sourced a ghostwriter, which Papyrus funded, to really enable us to reduce the document to the document that's now been circulated. It then went through a design phase at Universities UK, and it was published in December. And following publication, we've had a number of launches. One at my institution, Middlesex, in January, swiftly followed by Stirling, and we've still got Wales to go. Actually, Northern Ireland was before Stirling, and so Northern Ireland was the second one, and then Stirling. So we've just got Wales to go before we've done the launch in all 4 nations. So next slide, please, Simon. So Postvention in a HE setting is an organised response after a student death by suspected suicide to provide timely and appropriate crisis and support interventions for those affected by the death. So this is really what we're thinking about here. What happens in this instant, how we respond as an organisation. Next slide, please, Simon. So if we think about the aims of what we're trying to do with the guidance, first one is around supporting the grieving and adjustment process, and help those affected by the death to process immediate and long-term trauma and grief. Very much recognising that this needs to be layered and tailored to individuals and group. It's really having a team in place to address the immediate emergencies to stabilise the situation. It's not particularly a phrase I like using, but it's almost like you have a kind of like a crisis response which requires pre-planning and training in advance. We'll also aim to limit the potential risk of other suicides and imitative suicidal behaviour. So this is actions to prevent suicide clusters. Aiming to assist the community to start recovering from the initial intense trauma and gradually returning to some level of normality. So this, in some respects, is about really trying to move back to business as usual in an institution, recognizing that there's no set time, but also recognizing that there will be future trigger points, such as anniversaries and graduation. Final aim here is really to review and share learning, and really ensure that what we do as part of the postvention process improves future prevention and postvention response effort. I remember, Jed from Papyrus has really said to me a number of times, good postvention is prevention, and so we really need to learn from these incidents. And what has governed the overarching approach to our work is some guiding principles, which we really developed right at the start. First principles around acknowledging the profound impact on students, staff, and families, and that's really has informed our response. To respond with compassion and respect, being receptive to distress and sensitive to the needs of others. And it's really thinking about, in terms of an institutional response, this is so very, very different from other institution incidents, such as the loss of a building, for example. It's nothing like that at all. Ensuring timely engagement at the right levels, reaching out and connecting early, but it's also about adhering to protocols, ensuring that, for example, it's not for a HEI to inform the family, it's for the police, for example. Appropriate communications publicly about methods and use and appropriate sensitive language to minimize potential knowledge about suicide methods, which would potentially increase suicide risk for others. Avoid sensationalizing or normalizing suicide and remain sensitive and factual in all communications. You see as part of these principles how important communication is and getting the communication right. Thinking about recognizing that talking about suicide responsibly does not increase the likelihood of further suicidal behaviors, but talking with those affected is really important as part of their process to overcome what's happened. Adhering to information sharing protocols, providing clear information while protecting privacy and dignity of those affected and in accordance with legal requirements. Absolutely being sensitive to cultural and religious perspectives that may affect responses to a student suicide. And my colleagues will talk more about this when we talk about approaches, but embassies, for example, are really helpful here. And I think the final principle is a really important one, and that's really to aim to focus on the identity, life, and memories on the individual rather than their death by suicide. I'm now going to hand over to Jo.
Thank you. So hopefully you'll have seen the Postvention guidance. There was a link shared with the registration details, but it splits into three stages, and I'm going to talk about the first stage, and Simon's going to pick up with stage 2 and 3. And stage 1 is about what you can do in advance, and we certainly emphasise the importance of doing quite a number of things in advance, proactively preparing and planning, just as one might do in terms of fire safety procedures. It would be no good having a fire if you didn't have already identified fire escape routes and wardens and processes and knowledge about whose responsibility it is to ring the fire brigade and who greets the fire brigade and how you manage communications with staff and students. It's exactly the same principle in stage 1, which is about pre-incident, and I'll talk about this in a minute, proactive preparation and planning. Stage 2 talks about when there is an incident, when there is a student death by suspected suicide, and thinking about the incident response from the institution informed by the principles that David's just described. And then stage 3 is thinking about post-incident, thinking about the opportunity for debrief for staff and people who've been involved in supporting students, staff or families, the opportunity that this offers for review in terms of learning from a death. And I think that came over very strongly from bereaved families about the importance of that. And so built into this Postvention guidance is a serious incident review process to try and learn for the future and identify actions that can be taken by the institution, by individuals in terms of implementing learning from a student death. Next slide, please. So one of the things, because we're talking to yourselves as a student mental health research group who are interested in that, is that we had, in terms of involvement from a number of institutions, researchers involved who had carried out research in relation to student suicide and particularly postvention, of 2 of which you have here today to talk to you. And these are quotes taken directly from their research, which these are from Hillary's research, which she'll talk about. She's the 3rd speaker today. But this is one from a senior academic. The emotional landscape after a death by suicide can include anger, blame, guilt. And these are difficult to process and manage in a university setting which isn't set up really to deal with them. And I think this highlights the needs of staff and thinking about how we support staff in a setting where perhaps they find themselves in a dual role, both supporting others while at the same time needing support for themselves. The second, from a university team manager, I suppose what we didn't have at the time was more written guidance around suicide, particularly about what to do. That would have been useful, I think, for me at the time. And indeed, some of this feedback from the research from Hilary, from Deirdre and other colleagues has informed some of the content in terms of why we've produced a guidance. Next slide, please. So in terms of proactive preparation and planning, what we identify is that the institution develops an unexpected student death response plan. In other words, there's a plan in place that people know what the plan is, that people are trained in the plan, and that people are there to take a leadership role and enact elements of that plan. So alongside a death response plan, and again, you'll hear about this from Deirdre's research in terms of looking at death response planning in her own institution, is the importance of having a pre-identified, appropriately trained postvention team with a lead to facilitate a well-coordinated and compassionate postvention response. What you don't want is uncoordinated, untrained responses where people take responsibility, which may indeed, the intention may be honourable, but the action may not be helpful or may indeed duplicate. In the principles, we talked about the importance of communication, both in terms of the principles, but also the approach. And we had the benefit of both Samaritan's media guidance colleagues, as well as Papyrus, based on published national guidance on communicating information about suicide, both locally within the institution, to local media, and also in dealing with national media. The fourth area is about having partnerships with external agencies that you may need to draw on. A good example might be in terms of counselling support for people who are bereaved, that there may not be capacity within the institution, particularly if a death occurs on campus, that you may have to draw on the support of Samaritans and other organisations locally. So you need to know who they are, who the contacts are, and have the relationships with them to be able to draw on them. Equally, you may have external agencies providing residential accommodation. And so you need to have a partnership with them to make sure you're not duplicating. If a student death occurs within accommodation provision, that you both don't set off calling the police or taking action. And again, that can happen again where accommodation is shared between universities, that you have a relationship and an agreement across universities within the same city about how they will work together with an unexpected student death when it might occur in one set of accommodation but may impact on another university. Certainly, it's quite important to have resources and guidance document that you can immediately call on and download, not necessarily around suicide bereavement, because I think, as David pointed out, we can't call it a suicide at that point. Then we may suspect it is, but it is only a suspected suicide until the point that the coroner deems it a suicide or not. And so it's also important to have bereavement, general bereavement and grief counselling documents, as well as other resources. And we'll talk about some of those. Sam will talk about some of those in the towards the end. We also, at this time, there's often quite unexpected things that you might have to pay out for: a coach to take students to a funeral. It might be to send flowers to the family. It might be to bring a family over from abroad. It might be to transport belongings. So again, what we need is access to emergency funds. And finally, to have policies in place to support students and staff in terms of bereavement leave in this context, so that it's clear guidance on how to address this with individuals who may be seeking bereavement leave. Next slide, please. So in terms of the death response plan, there are a number of key elements. a notification protocol in terms of who and to whom news is broken, liaison with the family and significant others of the deceased, and we suggest that there should be a trained lead for that, and that's handled sensibly, but with a deputy just in case that person is sick or on leave. Someone who takes responsibility for liaison with relevant third parties, like I've mentioned, private accommodation providers. You need an information sharing protocol, identifying who else may need to be contacted. For example, it's important the Health Authority Suicide Prevention Lead is contacted. In Wales, it's important that you contact the statutory body covering universities in Wales. It may be with an international student, you need to contact the embassy. You may be with placement students, need to contact a placement supervisor. You also need to be clear about communications, both internal and external, and who deals with the media, which would largely be comms, a comms lead within the university. Providing support for those who found the student, support for all students and staff who may be affected, and their triage according to those most deeply affected. But you also need to think about funeral cremation service or its equivalent, and also think about how you handle memorials and also subsequent anniversaries, as well as returning the deceased possessions. Next slide, please. So in terms of the postvention team key roles, it's important that there is an identified lead who convenes and chairs the team meetings and engages the following key people following a critical incident that facilitates the support. They need to be pre-nominated, a senior member of the staff, a clear thinker who can provide direction with authority, but also importantly with empathy. You need someone who takes the lead on caring for students. It might be the Director of Student Services or equivalent. You also need someone identified who takes the lead on care for staff and communicating with staff, including outsourced accommodation providers and security, and that is likely to be a senior manager with support from Human Resource Services. Very importantly is someone who liaises with the family, but they need training because not all families may take the information, and indeed there may be cultural and religious issues that need to be addressed. So someone needs training in terms of handling that, and certainly it can help if it's someone who knew the deceased, but certainly someone needs to be identified with an identified deputy. A communications lead dealing with internal and external communications, including media interest. Often a student death, an unexpected death by suspected suicide does invoke a lot of media interest, and indeed local press can invoke national interest. So you need someone who's monitoring press and social media coverage. And finally, you need someone who actually keeps a detailed record of all the actions and decisions so that you've got a single referential information repository, a single source of truth, which is important for when it goes to the coroner or the procurator fiscal, which could be several months or even several years after the death. Next slide, please. So in addition, you may need someone to liaise with the police. As David's pointed out, it's a police role to actually inform family of the death, but you need to find out when that has happened before any other communications take place. Liaison with the coroner or procurator fiscal in Scotland. It may be with international students, the importance of liaising with the embassy. As I've mentioned, with accommodation provision, you may need to liaise with a senior representative from that accommodation provider and to avoid duplication. But you also may want to draw on the space of multi-faith teams and diversity advisors, particularly where there are religious and cultural issues. And added to that, support from representatives from the students' academic school, chaplaincy, counselling, the faculty, health and safety, security, a whole range of different people, and including from registry to avoid unintended consequences where people are chased for unpaid fees or incomplete assignments. Next slide, please. So in terms of training, What we don't talk about is taking a sledgehammer approach where everyone gets trained in everything. We're suggesting it should be targeted to the need and role. So particularly the postvention team leader should have training in terms of critical incident response training. But for liaison roles, family, staff and students, breaking news, trauma response training, bereavement support, suicide bereavements training, and particularly around addressing cultural or religious sensitivity issues. In terms of suicide bereavement, you need to ensure you've got sufficient members of staff, and that may mean drawing on additional support. And certainly we would suggest that a first port of call would be Samaritans, who actually have a team set up specifically to support institutions in this way, in their step-by-step programme, and will draw on advisors to support in the support of students and staff. But most importantly, we need to think about the supporters and think about their supervision and support arrangements for debrief, and to prevent what we call vicarious trauma responses, where first responders or grief supporters end up being traumatised themselves from listening to trauma stories. So we need to make sure that there are supervision and support arrangements in place for people involved in the postvention team roles, but also in relation to those support roles for students and staff. Next slide, please. So this is taken from Deirdre's work, which you'll hear about in a minute when we talk about the impact on students. And I think one of the things that people questioned was, you know, why do specific guidance around originally the original Universities UK guidance on suicide prevention and this on postvention? And I think this first quote, is it just accepted that suicide is part of life, part of student life? And you think how sad that is, that that's the comment that someone makes in relation to this experience. We don't want it. We don't want to be complacent. We don't want student suicide to be accepted as something that happens in the course of student life. And so we want to do all we can to prevent it when it happens, but also make sure that the response, if it does happen, is one which prevents further deaths by suicide. Again, the other quotes comment on the impact on students, both short-term and long-term, but this also talks about the needs of families. This is from David Moss in a book I edited. I wanted to have contact with those who knew him and recognise the unspeakable loss of his early death. I was deeply moved by the letters I received. He was known, cared about and appreciated. It mattered a great deal in those weeks following his death. Later, I received letters from his undergraduate head of department in the university, but it was these warm personal messages from his teachers that meant the most. And I think for us, people like the involvement of David in this process, again, was important, highlighting the principles that we can go through a process and send standard letters, but if they don't have compassion and empathy and feeling, it doesn't hit the point. Whereas what he's talking about here is the importance of hearing about his son talked about in an affectionate way, and indeed in terms of his identity and life at the university. I'm going to hand over to Simon, I think, now.
Thank you very much, Jo. Can you hear me? Okay, Jo, just nod if you
Yeah.
can hear me. Yeah, good stuff. Thank you. When you're driving the desk as well, it's hard to see. So the middle part of Jo's talked there a lot about the proactive planning in advance, and the kind of the heart of the guidance, if you like, really talks to very practically and operationally the incident response piece itself. And these are the main kind of sections of this, and I'll highlight a couple of these in the next few slides. So the overall institutional response, the way that the postvention team actually works and operates in reality, not just sort of trained and put together, but you know, what they do, the specific tasks required in the moment of dealing with the initial crisis, and some of the sort of the shorter term things downstream of that. A focus on the needs and support of families, students and staff, and Jo's again just sort of pulled that out. Those quotes are so powerful in terms of giving you that sense, and certainly that piece around vicarious trauma is one that resonates, you know, with me, and I can think of a couple of our colleagues in Manchester where for them, actually, that has been an issue, and we've had to then to deal with that. It's something we've put a lot of interventions in place to try and prevent that vicarious trauma and certainly to mitigate against it. And then, as I'll come to on a later slide, I focus on suicide cluster prevention as well. But really in the heart of that, and particularly touching on the top elements of that, is an appendix to the, or an annex really, I should say, to the main guidance, which is a very comprehensive postvention checklist. So this is something that can be downloaded separately. It's not part of the main document. And it literally is what it says on the slide, a checklist you print off, you can write notes on, you can tick things off as you go. And this was developed based on experience, particularly from Manchester and York and others, of where colleagues had, including myself, had dealt very specifically on the ground with the death of a student by suspected suicide. And it takes you through step by step all of the considerations that you might need to think about, including all of the points that Joe and David have already made. So some of the sort of issues around cultural sensitivity, some of the piece around staff support and the mitigation against vicarious trauma, for instance, is covered in there. And then some of the sort of the more medium-term considerations. There's a whole section on families and some of the things and the considerations around interacting with families and friends of the person who has died, for instance. Probably also important to say this element of it in particular has far wider applicability, and the same is true of much of this guidance. Although we're focusing on postvention, the applicability of this in any context around a student dying under whatever circumstances is quite strong. And in point of fact, in Manchester, we're just taking this and adapting this and using this to cover staff deaths as well through whatever means, because again, that applicability is there. I actually keep a copy of this printed out at work and at home because you never quite know when you're going to need it. And just having it there and being able to walk yourself through it, it saves you having to rethink everything each time as well, which is incredibly helpful. Now, this just gives you an example from it. I'm not going to go through the detail on this slide, but this is just an extract, if you like, from that around some specific tasks for the postvention team lead. In that very first instance around somebody being discovered deceased on university premises. And you can see for yourself the sort of level of detail that it goes into there, and some of the sort of pieces, as Joe has already highlighted, for instance, the point around notification is a role for the police, not for the university, and it gives some clarity around some of those points as well. But you know, if you just sort of in your mind imagine that sort of first phone call, maybe a member of security or residences team has found somebody, unfortunately, who's died in their room, and you can start to see, if you sort of follow each of those steps through, the level of detail within the guidance, and it goes on from there, of course. Now, we also touch on in here, and again, there may be colleagues on the call for whom this is an area of research interest, but we do touch on suicide clusters as well. There's a definition over on the left-hand side, although I'm sure many of you on the call, given your backgrounds, will be familiar with this, but a situation where 3 or more unexpected deaths occur in terms of time, location, and or method. Now, again, you know, it's very easy when you are, or too easy, I should say, when you're focused in the immediacy of dealing with a particular crisis and the death of a student, to perhaps not think forward enough in terms of thinking about factors like mitigation against clustering. Now, David touched earlier on about OHID, and Joe, the role of local public health teams. And this is actually where those partnerships are really important, because they have a lot of wider responsibility, clearly, than do universities. It's individual universities for thinking about clustering in that wider community. And some of that clustering will be around location, particular means and methods that an individual may have used as well. And so those relationships are incredibly important. Again, just thinking from the Manchester context specifically, I've had some very helpful discussions with British Transport Police and our local public health team about a couple of specific locations that are of concern, that through our own data, we've highlighted just from a methods point of view and a location point of view of areas that need some further intervention. And again, that requires that wider partnership approach. The other thing I think I wanted to highlight on this, and we touch on in the document, is it's easy too easy to think about clustering in a too short term a view, and clustering, might not necessarily be limited by short-term duration in time. And I like to extend this kind of definition to think actually of looking back over a number of years, and we do this frequently in our own data, and looking to see, are there other trends in our data around suicide, suspected suicide, and even serious self-harm that perhaps are of concern for us. So for instance, I know that we've identified recently one particular academic programme that we now feel needs some specific intervention and consideration because of a number of serious incidents and indeed sadly suicides over the last 5 years of students on that particular course. Now, as we turn then to, just before I move to the final section of the guidance, this is another quote from a bereaved parent. And again, important to read out in full. I think the future will be safer if we learn from the past, what went well, what did not, and what we can do differently. If universities are defensive, a parent will hear, "We learn nothing from your child's death." If they're open to learning and change, a parent will hear, "There is hope for a better future. My child's death was not in vain." Now, this quote nicely introduces the final section, really, of the guidance. And although it's listed on there anonymously, I know that the person behind it particularly would happy for me to share it too. So that quote actually is from James Murray. James is the father of Ben Murray, who died by suicide at the University of Bristol a few years ago. And James was part of the group that worked with us on this guidance. And if I just go back to those words again, you just think about it in that context. And James's point is about, not looking for blame, and I'll come to that in a second, but it's very much around whenever you have these sorts of situations, or even serious near misses or incidents of serious self-harm, there will almost always be some form of learning or reflection that can inform the future. Go back to what David said earlier on, this point about postvention being one of the really strong forms of prevention and informing approaches to prevention. That's really what this quote here from James is talking about. And that's what the final section of the guidance talks about. So it focuses a lot on serious incident review and a process around that, which I'll come to a bit more specifically in one second. We also have sections in there around bereavement, trauma support, which Joe's touched on to some extent, considerations around funeral arrangements, tributes, memorials, and then thinking through some of the, again, this starts to talk to the longer term as well. So legacies, anniversaries. Again, there's always a lot of focus, understandably, in the immediacy of the aftermath of somebody dying as part of the university community. But as time goes on, during the course of an academic year, people get other priorities and so on. And what the guidance is highlighting is the importance of not forgetting some of those key things that might come along. So a birthday, the date of the funeral, graduation event, exams, end of term parties, moving out of flats, moving into a new one, but with a member of that friendship group no longer a part of it. So some of those things are really important considerations as well. I'm thinking about what further interventions and support might be required. The inquest as another example, for instance. And then touching on inquests, and again, just noting, of course, the position is slightly different in Scotland. There's a whole section which can be downloaded alongside this around the coroner's inquest process itself, how that works, some advice about how to approach that, and some sort of good practice in terms of that. Working with both families and the coroner with candour and openness about supporting the inquiries of the coroner into the cause of death. Now, just going back to that post-incident review piece, and again, I'm really pleased this section of the guidance was shaped both by colleagues like myself who have experience of doing such reviews from a university point of view, but also by some bereaved families thinking about their own experiences. And I won't read out all of these points, but this top one on here in particular is really important, as I've already highlighted. The purpose of such reviews is not, categorically not, to identify fault or blame. It's about trying to just reflect and think about and understand whether there are any learnings for the future. That point about being objective and constructive, looking at things in a, as quickly after the incident as possible, and trying to identify, are there sort of particular questions that have been raised as a result of what has happened. One of the examples I like to give when I talk about this section is, often I think there's a concern from some universities, at least, that an approach like this will only ever be used actually to try and find fault or blame, and that there might not be learnings. If the student somehow didn't die whilst they were actively at the university, or they died somewhere else, well, what is there for the university to learn? An example I like to use is of a PhD student from Manchester who died last year. His name was Sam. There was nothing materially when we did a serious incident review that either us as a university, his family, or indeed later the coroner believed would have made a difference in terms of the way that the university supported Sam. However, by going through a serious incident review process, we identified something like 30 or so actions, and just minor things, some a little bit more so for the future, that we could take just to improve the experience of our students, to make communications about access to support information that little bit better, a little bit stronger. Some of the sort of community building amongst the PGR community, for instance, that little bit better. So, there were still a number of elements of actions that we identified, even though, materially there was agreed that there's nothing further that we could have done to have prevented what had sadly happened. I'll just skip over that just for the purposes of time. It largely covers what I've already said, and then just almost finishing up on this section before we hand over to Deirdre. The guides then also, and these are downloadable alongside it, touch on some of the things we've already said. So there are some specific resources available, that Postvention checklist. There are role descriptors for each of those roles within the Postvention team that were touched on earlier. Security staff, there's a whole section around that. And in fact, I've talked about this guidance at the Association of University Managers Conference a few weeks ago, specifically around security staff, who are often the first responders to incidents on campus. There's communication templates, the procedure around how to conduct a serious incident review, the inquest guidance that I've touched on, and then a number of other resources. And there are, this is just a couple of them on here. There's a whole bunch of others, all grouped under different headings. And also just a cheeky plug on there for the book that Joe mentioned in passing earlier on, Preventing and Responding to Student Suicide, which came out last year. And you can see the details, including how to get a discount on that on the screen. She do sign copies, but unfortunately this is a virtual event, so you'll have to forego that. So that's the end of the first section. I think I'm handing over to Deirdre now, so I'm going to move on to her slides, Deirdre, and I'll let you pick up from there.
Thank you, Simon. And we can move straight on to the next slide. My name is Deirdre Flynn. I'm going to talk to you today about a piece of research that I did for a doctorate in education in the University of Bristol, on the experiences of sudden student death, and it was a narrative inquiry. The university was in Ireland, large student body, about 18,000 students at the time. 70% of these were undergrads and 20% were international students. I did the work between 2010 and 2014. I myself had been in the university as a staff member since '93. I was the director of the student counselling services in the university. I'm also a registered psychotherapist and supervisor. When I arrived, took up the post in '93 in the university, they didn't have a death response plan, which I will refer to as a DRP. That didn't exist. And I was involved in assisting the university to develop the very first one for the university. I also had previously, in a previous post for 6 years, had worked with terminally ill people in oncology, patients and families in an oncology, hematology unit, and then with AIDS and HIV. Thanks, Simon. So that's just to give you a piece of the context, because I think context is all important in terms of our research, and I'll refer to that later. So what I set out to do was to evaluate the experiences of parents, of students, and of staff of the college response when a student had died unexpectedly. So the student being a son or a daughter, a friend, a classmate, or somebody that the staff had lectured and known. I choose narrative inquiry as my methodology. I think there's a nice quote to say, narrative is really, it's a core psychological and social process. It's also a concept, I think, that can help us investigate the link between experience, meaning, and social structures and culture. And I was very interested in understanding people's experiences and their construing. Thanks, Simon. So the research findings, very quickly, in terms of my interviews with parents, I did one-to-one interviews I did with parents. I did group interviews with students and with staff. I also did a case study. So I interviewed a parent and asked if he would be okay about me interviewing staff in the school and friends, and that got support from everybody. So there was one case study as well as group interviews with staff, students in relation to other deaths. Information is key for parents. It's already been highlighted by Joe and Simon and David. So an acknowledgement by the university of the loss of their loved one and their own personal loss. So these are the things that were really important for students. They all are for parents. They all had their own unique ways of remembering and staying connected with their loved one. Students were impacted in a variety of ways. Sometimes that depended on the relationship they had with the deceased. It also, which I hadn't anticipated finding, classes who are very socially connected and bound together actually in some ways didn't need as much support as classes that were less connected with each other. So they found it much harder to harness the peer support and the group support. What really is needed is a timed, tailored and targeted response. You really need to look at everyone who's impacted and look at what they need. And that's different for the different students. Overall acknowledgement by the university of the death is incredibly important to students. They do not want it brushed under the carpet, and they have expectations that the university will acknowledge it and will also acknowledge their personal loss. Highlighted by the staff interviews were the impact of student suicide on students in the university who had pre-existing mental health difficulties. They didn't need to be in the same class or even know the students, but several of the academic staff commented that that was more difficult. Thanks, Simon. In relation to the interviews I did with staff, they were impacted by the nature of the death. So a suicide left them with the inevitable questions: could they have done something differently? All of the questions that we already know about that come up for us when a death is by suicide. Depended on their relationship too with the student, and it also depended on the impact they saw on the other students that impacted them, and also their own bereavement experiences played a part. One of the things that came up very strongly for the staff is how much they value peer support. In other words, other academic staff who had been through something similar, if they reached out to them, that they found that so useful. And the students as well valued peer support, although the research is mixed about this, and advocates that really we need to train students in how to be peer supporters, because unlike when you lose someone, say at my age, most of my colleagues will have lost people and have that experience, whereas somebody at undergraduate level may not have, most of them won't have had a close bereavement experience. We'll pass on. Thanks, Simon. So in terms of the university response, because that's what I set out to understand, you know, most of us in student services where our colleges have death response plans, we do our best, and we assume that the response is good enough, but actually the findings, my findings really indicated the need to hugely expand the death response plan, get down into the detail. I see somebody there put a question mark about, well, what happens out of term? That's one of the things I definitely got feedback from parents, that the response needs to be the same. 24 or the 12 months of the year, and irrespective of where it happens and at what time a response is required. So contagion prevention needs to be a key aim. Collaborative partnership with students is really important. If you look at their developmental stage, they want to be involved. They're transitioning to adulthood, where doing things for themselves is really important. So if we can embody that in our response plans, that's good. Cultural, religious sensitivity, that's been referred to. Opportunities for remembrance and connection, I think very important. One of the things, evidence-based practice and theoretical foundations. Most of the death response plans that I reviewed, both in an Irish context and in an American context, very few of them made a direct link with the theoretical underpinning of their response plan. Now, I think that's a pity, because the plans who really spoke much more about counselling services were very much informed by traditional theories of bereavement, which, you know, notionally said that we were to process our bereavement and we could only do so by talking about it. Now, the postmodern theories are very different in terms of bereavement. It's much more about how we can stay connected with our lost ones. So I think that's something that's worth considering. Thanks, Simon. So in terms of the research, if you're doing research in this area, and I'm now going to look at what I learned over the 4 years, we should start from the same basis that practitioners start with, which is do no harm. And we have to think about re-traumatizing people and the length of time since the death happened. Now, the research literature is very mixed about this. It does not give a time for participants. So one of the people I talked with before embarking on my research had done a lot of research with families who've been bereaved by motor neuron disease. And she said to me, in all her interviews, she noticed that the families or the partners or spouses who had had a bereavement less than 2 years were much, much more distressed by her interviews. So I decided on that basis that I would not interview parents who had been bereaved in the previous 2 years. You also need to think about what are the people's expectations in terms of participation. Interestingly, some of the parents would have found the interviews very therapeutic. Now, being a therapist and a researcher, I had to be very clear that I was primarily, I was a researcher, but using my therapeutic skills in terms of how the interviews were conducted. So that's something, you know, most parents were very happy to participate if they felt that it would improve the service for other people. But some of them, some of their families encouraged them to participate because they felt it would be therapeutic for them. The catalytic effects, I think, were really struck me in terms of the groups of staff that I brought together. And many of them at the end of the session said, you know, that listening to a response from another or the experience of another staff member, that they had learned so much, and in future they might adapt or adopt some of the things that staff member had done for the class or for the, so that was quite interesting. I think you have to think a lot about confidentiality. In group interviews, it's fairly straightforward. Everybody has to agree that what's said in the group stays in the group. But when I was doing a case study, it was obvious that the girlfriend who I interviewed, the father who I interviewed, and the groups of students would all know what each other had said, because there was no way of, so they all knew and read their transcripts were read, and what I wrote was read by them all, so that they were happy that their interviews would be accessible and identifiable to that particular group of staff, father and students, friends. Thank you, Simon. Institutional concerns. If you're going to do research on suicide, you know, reputation and blame will come to the fore for any institution or any clinic or any, and I think you really have to think that through. Identification of the institution. Will the institution be identifiable? And how does or will the institution feel about that? And what do you do to protect it or not? It needs to be a consideration. I think it's a big factor in particularly in research around suicide, whether the researcher is known to the institution, whether the researcher is trusted by the institution and has the institution support or not. I had been in the institution since '93. I had assisted with the development of the death response plan. I was involved in all the responses since '93. Now there were pluses and minuses to that, of course, in terms of the research, but the institution was incredibly supportive. I think helped by student services has, in the last 20 years, evidence-based practice has become very important within the student services context, and research is much more to the fore and much more supported. Prior to that, going way back, student services probably did what they thought was best under the circumstances. We're much more conscious now of the need for best practices. If your institution is very much committed to quality improvement and standards, then they're more likely to buy into this type of research. I think you need to be very clear about what responsibilities or ability you have to implement change. I was able to review the death response plan in my institution after my research, and we totally overhauled it. We further developed it, fleshed it out. And that was a particular privilege and a particular responsibility, and one that was kind of important to parents. The other thing that I note from the literature that Drygov, and forgive me, Norwegian, I cannot pronounce his name properly, was very adamant that researchers in the area of suicide really need to be trained in terms of dealing with emotions and containment, etc. Simon, I think we're near the end. So that takes us nicely into the emotional impact of participants' grief. Never underestimate this. You're going to spend hours with doing interviews, hours listening and re-listening to tapes. And it is upsetting work. I knew going into it. and especially given I had had years of previous work experience in the units that I had worked in. But it's really important that you plan for that and you expect it, and you in a way have a support system. I had a fabulous team in the service who I could talk to at any time and offload what it needs to be built in. If you haven't had a lot of previous experience of really listening to and containing distress, I would seek training in it. I would organise support for yourself. And then finally, you know, when researchers are part of the context in which I was, that shapes the research in a very different way than if you're an outsider coming in. Both have pluses and both have minuses. Thanks.
Hilary, I think you're going to share your own slides, is that right?
Yes, hopefully that's up already.
Yeah, that's fine.
There we go. Just bear with me a moment. Need to find out how to exit the full screen on my laptop so I can see my notes. If anybody has a hint on that, that'd be helpful.
Do you want me just to share your slides? Would that be easier?
That might be easier, yes. Yeah, apologies. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Here we go. Okay, so apologies for the delay. So yes, thank you very much, Deirdre. That was really interesting oversight. So I'm Hilary. I'm a research fellow currently at the University of Surrey. However, I undertook this study that I'm going to talk about today as a PhD student at the University of Worcester. And I'm going to give you an overview of that research and talk a little about some of the struggles that I encountered on the way. So with this study, I set out to explore the experiences of staff at 2 United Kingdom higher education institutions following a student death by suicide. If we could move on to slide 2.
This one here, yeah.
Apologies. My screen is going a bit, there we go, for some reason. So, sorry. So I undertook an initial narrative literature review that revealed that there is very little published literature regarding student suicide in higher education settings. And that which was published at the time explored the incidence of student suicide in comparison to the age-related general population, or it seeks to understand specific factors that may heighten the risk of suicide for students. There was no research at that time that explored the impact of student suicide, and specifically none which sought to understand the experiences of staff members. Further, the practitioner in postvention literature is most often positioned as the provider of postvention support rather than as a potential recipient of support. And finally, the literature review confirmed that there was no evidence-based postvention guidance specifically aimed towards HEIs at that time. So to learn more, I undertook a qualitative research synthesis. That's the paper pictured on the screen here. 12 published articles were eligible for inclusion. And the key finding of this synthesis was that context matters. So whether that be workplace cultures, national legislation, or cultural belief systems, the experiences of practitioners were shaped by the contexts within which they occurred. And this review was published in 2019. Okay, next slide. So with all of that in mind, I set out to answer the question, how is a student suicide experienced by staff members within a UK HEI, and what are the features of that experience? My methods were informed by my interest in the perceptions and meaning-making processes of staff members who were impacted by a student suicide. I collected categorical and open text data via an electronic survey, and then invited participants to express an interest if they wished to be interviewed by me in more depth. I used qualitative data from both the survey and the interviews to construct a grounded theory analysis. I recruited 19 participants into the survey, 10 of whom took part in the interviews. Participants were from across a range of job roles, as shown on the slide here. Some participants had known the student before they died, but the majority did not and were involved because of their job role in response to a suicide. Okay, next slide. So my analysis developed a core category which describes the overriding nature of the experience, bearing witness. From the beginnings of the experience, the discovering of a body or hearing news of a death, student members became witnesses to the death by suicide of a student. The term bearing is fitting, as staff described a sense of having to carry this knowledge, the weight of what has happened. Participant accounts led me to understand that bearing witness to a student suicide informs and is informed by the acts of responding to and the processes of experiencing a student suicide. So at the top of the diagram here, we have that core category of bearing witness, and then below are those next two categories, responding to and experiencing a student suicide. And there was a palpable tension and an entanglement between these two aspects of participants' accounts. Put very simply, the necessity to respond, to be professional and practical and supportive, interrupted or complicated participant processes of engaging emotionally or personally with the fact that a student at their university had taken their own life. This entangled experience of doing and feeling gave rise to a range of needs and fears, which in turn led to diverse experiences of support. And underpinning these categories were two further categories at the bottom here, which describe in human stories, the personal experiences or traits of individual staff members, and in cultural stories, the social and cultural contexts within which the participants operated and experienced the suicide. Both categories informed the ways in which participants perceived their own needs, their fears, and their experiences of support. Next slide. So a number of recommendations came from this research. I'm not going to read them out, they're there for you to have a look at, but what was really important to me when I entered this PhD as a student coming from a practice background, I wanted my research to speak to practice. That was really important. And so having these recommendations, the ones for practice in particular, taken on board and feeding into the development of the postvention guidance that we're talking about today, has absolutely enabled me to travel full circle in a way. So I'm really delighted that this research has fed into the guidance that has been developed for the higher education, further education sectors. So the next slide. So I think this is the final slide. So as with any research around a sensitive topic, and Deirdre has spoken really, really well with the considerations that we need to make when researching topics around suicide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we faced. So particular attention needed to be paid to ethical issues, particularly the psychological safety of participants. However, one of the biggest challenges that I faced was in engaging universities to take part in the study. So in some cases, I spent many months in communication with some institutions, only for them to decide that the study wasn't right for them. I struggled to get clarity from them around the reasons for this, and so I can only hypothesize that reasons included a lack of time and resource, and also a level of fear. During the years of my PhD, there was a lot of very challenging media coverage around the topic of student suicide, which created a heightened sensitivity throughout the HE sector. So whilst this study was really timely in that sense, I believe it was also challenged by the stigma and fear that encompassed the topic of student suicide. I did engage 2 institutions, however, but even so, participant recruitment within them proved to be slow and participant numbers were disappointing, even though the data that I was able to gather was of a high quality. Finally, given the small sample size, I found myself methodologically challenged in undertaking a grounded theory analysis. So whilst I was unable to undertake theoretical sampling of participants, I resolved this issue by utilising the qualitative data that I had gathered in the survey and used this during the later stages of analysis as a means of confirming category development and seeking any further data that might affirm or dispute the analytic process. So finally, I just want to thank you for listening, and thank you especially to Network Smarten for hosting the event and inviting me to take part. I also need to acknowledge the support of my PhD supervisors, Professor Joe Smith, who's here today, Professor Eleanor Bradley and Dr. Kate Muse. And finally, I do want to acknowledge the generosity and the tenacity of the study participants who shared their experiences with great courage and with resolve. So thank you very much.